Well, we thought that before opening up the discussion to all of you, I would start by raising one or two questions, and then please, there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to follow as well. So the first question I wanted to ask you really is about all these guys having sex and double standards. And given the pervasive social controls that are in place, who are these guys, all these guys having sex with? How does a world of double standards actually operate?
So we have quite an interesting phenomenon in the Arab region. As I said, it's very hard to do research, empirical research around sexual attitudes and behaviors. But in some cases you can. In some countries you manage to ask. And it's largely because of HIV. HIV gives you a sort of public health respectability to ask these questions. And in particular, this is very sensitive around unmarried youth. And what we find when you do ask unmarried people about their sexual lives, that across the board, upwards of 30%, so 30, 40, 50, up to 70, 80% of young men, depending on where you're asking the question, will say they have had sex before marriage. And almost universally across the board, 80% of young women say they are not having sex before marriage. This, of course, raises the question, who are all these young men having sex with? Certainly there is an element of young men turning to sex workers certainly to make when they make their sexual debut. But the reality, of course, is that women are having relations before marriage, but they are unable to admit to it. Such is the primacy of virginity. And what's interesting about this, and this is something that I spoke to earlier, which is the gap between appearance and reality. So virginity is defined by a piece of anatomy, an intact hymen, the appearance, as opposed to the reality, which is a state of chastity. And this plays out in various ways, but if I could just give you one illustration concretely. In Morocco, I was out with a group which is trying to reduce the risks of HIV/AIDS for vulnerable populations. And one of the groups that they reach out to are female sex workers. So we were out one night in Casablanca, and these outreach workers were handing out condoms. And we met two young female sex workers who were students, and they were turning tricks in order to make some pocket money. And the outreach workers offered them condoms, and these young women said, no, we don't need condoms. There's no risk of us getting pregnant because we specialize in anal or oral sex because we want to get married and we have to be virgins. And so in the name of an intact hymen, these young women were opening themselves to a world of trouble, including HIV. And so yes, the primacy of the burden of regulation, the burden of proof, if you like, is on women.
Let me just ask you, the narrative you've given us this evening is something of a sort of pre-digital world. And of course, in the process that you've been doing this, I mean, the whole of the Arab world has been opened up to the internet. And I wonder what difference you think the internet is making to intimacy and the visibility of pleasure and sex. I mean, someone recently told me, I think it was Ava sitting over there, of a survey that's just come out that shows where in the world there are the most downloads of gay porn. And one of the places that hits the top is Pakistan, if I remember that. So it shows, again, this incredible tension between appearance and reality. And I just wonder how digitization and the internet play out in your narrative and how they have changed people's terms of reference, if at all.
Absolutely. I mean, my book was not written in a pre-internet age. I started doing the research in 2007, 2008, and of course there was social media. It's much more prominent now after the uprisings, but certainly was present there. As in most parts of the world, the internet has both benefits and also detrimental effects depending on where you're looking. If I can give you two illustrations, certainly for men and women who have sex with their own sex or who have a different gender identity, the internet can be transformative because one of the problems they face is really a sense of isolation. They don't have a chance to talk about these issues. Very often they think that they're alone. And it's not just finding gay porn, frankly, which can be transformative for some young people. They realize that they're not alone in their in their behaviors, but also online communication despite the fact that it does have risks. I mean, there is the phenomenon of police entrapment, for example, in Egypt. They use the internet to catch gay men. Nonetheless, the internet is really valuable for some of the emerging NGOs that are trying to figure out how are we going to support men and women who cross the heterosexual line. How can we find a place for them in society? And so they're able to provide, for example, information in Arabic about homosexuality. Very informative online magazines are now appearing. So it is reducing the isolation, it is reducing the ignorance, but it is also still for a minority, because in a place, in Egypt, for example, only a minority of most young men and women have access to the internet. But it plays another way, too. And so very often for married couples, in Egypt in particular, they mentioned about really the detrimental consequences of the internet. That I have one episode in my book, for example. I went to a hairdresser who not only cuts hair but specializes in a form of magic, basically, which is actually very popular in Egypt and many parts of the Arab region. And women were coming in to get, in a sense, talismans in order to make their husbands faithful. And one of the things this hairdresser mentioned is that she was being confronted by women who were saying that their husbands wanted all sorts of sexual practices, which they had seen on the internet, in pornography in particular. And yet when their wives tried to add some spark in the bedroom, considered it to be shameful. And in one case, a man who his wife had been reading about these issues on the internet, she managed to find some material in Arabic. And when she tried to show some spark on their wedding night, he hauled her out of bed and made her swear on the Quran that she had not had experience before marriage. Another interesting consequence of the internet, and in particular pornography, is around the phenomenon of female genital mutilation. I mentioned it in passing. It's common in Egypt. About 80% of young women between the age of 15 and 17 have been circumcised. And this circumcision in Egypt essentially involves clipping the clitoris and taking off the neighboring flaps of flesh as well. There are a number of reasons why circumcision is done in Egypt, but the main driver is to control female sexuality. But what's interesting is that this decision to circumcise or not circumcise is mainly made by women. And historically, men really haven't been involved in this. And in fact, they almost didn't know if their wives were circumcised or not, because they have so little sexuality education in schools. They don't know what normal female anatomy looks like. What's interesting is the effect of pornography, however, because now they see these videos. And it's very interesting, some of these men who were interviewed in a study I cite in the book, they now have a very definite opinion about female circumcision, and they think it's a good idea, because they see these pornographic videos, and they say, look, we told you so. These women in the videos, these Western women, they're not circumcised, and they're having sex with 2-3 men at a time. We told you we need to circumcise our girls. This is what might happen. So pornography, the internet, is both a boon and a bane. It just depends on the context, really.
Okay. Well, one other obvious question to ask you then, in terms of transformative forces, is of course the recent political turmoil in the Middle East from the Arab Spring onwards. And of course Egypt's seen it all, opening up, liberalization, the return of the army. And I wonder how the story you tell maps or changes with these tumultuous developments in politics.
Very often people, certainly in the context of the book, talk about revolution, political revolution. And I never use the term revolution in my book, because quite frankly, even in the political context, if by revolution you mean a dramatic break with the past, we're essentially not seeing it in politics. So we're certainly not going to see revolutionary change in sexual life, because it's so much more complex. But certainly we are seeing changes in interesting aspects of sexuality. To give you one example, when I started researching this book in 2007, 2008, hardly any women would speak openly about sexual harassment. And certainly no woman would admit to having been raped. If you fast forward, and certainly after the dramatic events, these organized sexual assaults that we saw in Tahrir Square earlier this year, you now find women speaking out about rape, and you find men speaking out and standing alongside them. So the greater freedom of expression that people now feel is having a certain impact on certain aspects of sexuality and sexual rights. But there are limits, of course. So to give you another example, is everyone here familiar with the Femen movement? Do you know Femen? For those who may not, this is a women's rights group which had its origins in the Ukraine, and its form of protest is topless. And a couple of young women have tried to bring that form of protest back to the Arab region with quite serious consequences for them. And it's not just conservatives who object to these women, but it's also liberals as well. And so while we are making movement on some aspects of sexual rights, certainly the right to access information, to express your ideas openly about sexuality, the right to make decisions about if, getting married or not, those are still constrained by the overall social, I would say over the overall social landscape more than the political landscape.
Let me ask just one more question before I hand over to the audience. And it's this: there's a long history, as you know, of Western traditions, Westerners writing about sex. And this is often labeled as sort of the Orientalist tradition. So what makes your approach to this subject different?
It's a very good question. I think in part it's a question of how you do the research. So there is a famous instance I talk in my book about the famous French novelist Gustave Flaubert, who traveled across Egypt, and to put it quite bluntly, he essentially fucked his way up the Nile. So my mode of research was much less up close and personal. I just talked to people. Also, there is the tone of this research. I mean, the tone of this writing in the past. It's very much sort of projecting the Middle East through a prism of Western ideas about sex. And again, as Edward Said argued, to use sex as a tool to really justify Western hegemony. My intent in writing this book was very different. It wasn't just to understand the sexual culture of the Middle East. It was to try to better understand myself as someone who has a foot in that world. And also there's the question of agency, really. The voices that you hear in these books in the past are the voice of the Western author. And in my book, I have tried very much to give readers the authentic voice. And very often when you hear the voice when you read the people in my book, the characters, the individuals in my book, you will hear their expressions. They don't speak perfect English. They speak in idiom. They speak with ideas which are often very different to the way we express these ideas in the West. But that's the intent of the book. I want you to hear their voices. And at the end of the day, I'm really just a conduit for their ideas and really for their bravery and their determination to try to forge better sexual lives, happier sexual lives for themselves and also for the coming generations.
Okay, well, many thanks. Some beautifully clear responses. The floor is open. We're happy to take questions. The mic will come to you. So let me just start with one or two Durham experts here. Would you have a question to begin with? Come on. Let's go straight to the front.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. I was just wondering, you touched on, for instance, female genital mutilation in Egypt. I was wondering whether you could say something about the link or absence thereof between female genital mutilation and religion, because of course in Egypt it's not just Muslims but also Coptic women who are circumcised, and whether you found that across the region, and so there are differences between the countries.
Daniel is too modest in not introducing himself, but this is Professor Daniel Newman, for those who do not know him. And as I mentioned, Daniel's great translations of some of the classics of Arabic literature were enormously beneficial in my own research and are really opening this world of literature to others. So I'm very grateful to Daniel for his work. On the point of female genital mutilation, very often you will find women in Egypt will justify it on religious grounds, and they will quote a hadith, which is a saying about it's an account of the sayings or the deeds of the Prophet, and the Prophet is one of these hadiths suggests that the Prophet said that one should circumcise a woman, but not too deeply so that it does not cause pain to her or her husband. The issue about this hadith, like so many hadiths around women's sexuality and women in general, it's open to debate. It's highly controversial. And yet, many of the women I spoke to in Egypt took it as gospel, if you like. They were not willing to countenance that there was any alternative interpretation. What's interesting in Egypt is that, of course, we have the major religious figures who, during the Mubarak regime, came out very strongly against female circumcision. We have the former Grand Mufti, Ali Goma, who came out swinging, saying this has no basis in Islam whatsoever. It is a custom which predates Islam. It cannot be justified on the basis of religion. Also, the Coptic Church, the leadership also came out very, very strongly against the practice. What was interesting, though, is that in talking to many women in Egypt, they completely discounted these religious leaders because their argument was that the Mubarak regime was essentially in bed, if you like, with the West, and that this was a regime which was completely unaccountable to the people, and that they were trying to foist a Western agenda on Egyptians, and that the government had no role in private life, and frankly, that these religious leaders were hired guns that were just espousing an agenda for the government. So I met some women who were actually circumcising their daughters as a form of resistance to the regime. Now, whether this will change in the emerging order as we stumble our way in a highly sort of scenic route to democracy, we will see. On the subject, though, of FGM among Christian communities and Muslim communities. What is interesting is that now we do see a difference in levels of FGM amongst Muslims and Christians, and it's much lower in the Christian communities. But the reason for that is that in Christianity, in Coptic Christianity in Egypt, there is a pope and there is a hierarchy and there is a message which comes from on high and it's a central message, and then it's preached in the churches. And as a consequence, they've all been on the same page, and we have seen a decline, irrespective of some of the suspicion about the leadership. In Sunni Islam, it's very different. We don't have a central leadership. Yes, we have Al-Azhar, we have the Grand Mufti. Nonetheless, at the village level, individual imams tend to go their own way, basically. And very often they will be preaching in favor of FGM, although the leadership has a very different view. When the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, there were real concerns that the FGM would suddenly take off, and all the campaigns that have been tried in Egypt over decades to reduce FGM, they would be abandoned. We'll now see what happens as we move forward. But if everything were to continue, all the efforts were to continue in the way that they had under the Mubarak regime, the estimates are that only 50% of girls will be circumcised by 2025, and that's down from 90% 10 to 15 years ago.
Perhaps there is a question at the front. Perhaps that each of you could just say who you are, so we have a sense of who's here.
Hello, my name's Kirsty. I'm a second-year Castleman. I'm reading anthropology. I was just wondering, do you feel the taboo regarding no sex before marriage, does it solely repress sexual desire? Or do you feel that there's an argument that it could be reflecting a greater need, a kind of societal feeling of a need to cling to tradition amongst such change?
Certainly, I don't think it's suppressing sexual desire. Quite the contrary. Actually, I don't. Again, it's the question. And again, we don't have great empirical research on this. But certainly, talking to young people, many young women I met, for example, expressed tremendous frustration. Not that they were not able to have sex before marriage, but that they couldn't get married as early as they as they hoped, actually. And so very often young women would talk to me about their desire to remain virgins before marriage. Of course, some women do take the plunge, but again, female virginity is a very serious matter. And even amongst young women who take the plunge and will tell their prospective partners, for example, that they have had sex before marriage, there is always the fear that this admission will be brought back and be flung back in your face, basically, when your marriage gets a bit rocky and that your husband accuses you, you're not a good woman. So in many ways, women feel as if they're going to lose either way. What's interesting is that around issues of virginity, while women are now agitating on many, many fronts in Egypt and across the Arab region, whether it's driving in Saudi Arabia or political representation in Egypt, the one thing that you don't find them openly challenging yet is the primacy of female virginity. And interestingly, we had a case in Egypt in 2011. You may have heard of it. Some female protesters were subjected to forced virginity testing by the military government. And one of them took a court case against the military. But what she was questioning, or what she was challenging, was the forced aspect of the testing. Not once in that discussion did she question the importance of female virginity or why it should be relevant to what is essentially a political issue. So it's certainly, whether it's repressing desire, I certainly don't think so. Whether it's inhibiting action, certainly for some women, but we are not yet at the stage where they are actively challenging the right of a woman to have sex before marriage. Again, because we are looking for most women who want to live their lives within the parameters of their faith, be it Islam or Christianity, both faiths of which condemn sex before marriage. But you do find some women arguing about the double standards that they are starting to talk about. Not that they should have the right to have sex before marriage like men, but that men should be held to the same standards that they are not to have sex before marriage.
Many thanks for your very informative lecture. A quick comment and then a question. As to this conundrum of how so many young men are admitting to having these premarital relations but the women are not, as well as the relative honesty and the existence of sex workers, is there not also the question of large expatriate presences, perhaps not so much in North Africa, but certainly in Gulf states, Lebanon, etc., where a lot of the local women will complain that their men are being led astray pre-marriage by large communities of expatriate women who have very different code of conduct and do not have to conform to this citadel as such. Also, the question I wanted to ask is about these incredible stories we occasionally see of very brave women in places like Bahrain and elsewhere in the region who've tried to actually establish halal sex shops, as it were, behind a closed door, much like the liquor stores as well. You go inside and there's a huge range of everything imaginable you could buy, strictly for married women. But those shops always get shut down. Could you elaborate a bit on these and the pressures these women face? Thanks.
Great. Thank you for the question about expats. And it certainly is a point of tension, particularly in the Gulf states, of course, where in some of the smaller Gulf states we have minorities of local people and now majorities of expats. And the differing sexual standards can sometimes come into conflict, and most notably this happened over the summer with a Norwegian woman. You may have heard the story that she was raped, and when she went to file a charge with the police, she herself was arrested for immorality. And so there are real tensions building in these Gulf states about how to accommodate different sexual mores. In Egypt, the point that you're raising is quite interesting. I have a chapter in my book which is talking about the phenomenon of sex work. It cuts both ways, and so in resorts in many parts of Egypt and also in other parts of North Africa, you find the phenomenon of Western women who come on holiday, meet a man, and often engage in a temporary marriage. This is a marriage which has a sort of almost Islamic cover, and it's a point of considerable controversy in these communities. On the one hand, religious authorities will say, no, this is wrong that these women are coming to marry our men. Although in Islam, Muslim men are permitted to marry Jewish and Christian women. The concern here is that if the men are marrying foreign women, then it's depleting the pool of men, and what's going to happen to the local women? Will they be led astray? But in some cases, families actually would prefer, and wives indeed, would prefer their husbands to marry another woman, a Western woman who would provide them with money, than for him to go and have to spend years working in the Gulf away from the family. But what's interesting is that when young women are getting married to foreigners, Arab men who are coming on holiday, in these essentially what is a form of sex work, everyone is up in arms. And rightly so. But when these men are essentially engaging in sex work, it's considered to be another day's work. They're just men. On the subject of the sex shops, it is quite interesting. You're right, there have been online sex shops. And in fact, earlier this week or last week, one just opened up in Turkey. And they do have an interesting array of devices. I talk about this in my book. Interestingly, and Professor Newman can address this point, but interestingly, for almost every subject under the sun that's covered in Arabic erotica, sex toys actually don't feature very prominently, and you may have more insight on this than I have, Professor Newman, and we'd love to hear your views. Nonetheless, certainly anecdotally, when I was in Egypt, many of the women I spoke with, my married friends, they asked me to assemble what could best be described as a foreign aid package to buy sex toys to bring back for them. They're quite hard to find in many Arab capitals. In Cairo, for example, if anyone's been in downtown Cairo, you will see these shops with these fantastic array of lingerie. You know, Ann Summers has nothing on some of these shops in downtown Cairo, and yet it's very hard to find these sex toy shops. When I did assemble my foreign aid package and brought it back to Egypt, I must say it elicited absolute, gales of laughter from my friends. And they warned me not to bring back any devices which would make their husbands feel dispensable. So it was quite a general instruction there. But it was quite, I know this is being videoed, so I don't know if we're after the watershed. But let me just tell you one example. Okay, so there's, just because the sex toy episode actually revealed some very interesting aspects of intimate life that I had not considered before. So in particular, there are these toys called Benoit balls. They're like ping pong balls. They're inserted into the vagina to stimulate. And I showed these to my female friends, and they asked me, well, how do you use these? I said, well, you insert them. It's like a tampon. And it turned out that these women don't use tampons at all because they are afraid of breaking the hymen. And my friends whom I was talking to were married. They had a couple of kids each. I said, surely a hymen is not an issue now. And they said, we always have fear in this area. We never go near it. So the inhibitions run far and deep, basically. That being said, there are now online stores opening across the region. And even in Cairo, you can find stores that sell these toys discreetly. You just have to know where to look.
Hi, I'm Ali, and I'm doing sociology here in Durham University. It was a very interesting debate, and one of the key things that you said was that in Arab, it's becoming more like a frustration. The age gap between when you reach your puberty to when you get married, and you're not allowed to have sex in the middle. That's where a lot of frustration comes in. Problems like women losing their virginity and then being a disgrace to the entire family. Well, that's so. If, for example, and you in the start of the speech you mentioned that since economically the husbands are not well off, they don't have enough money to support their marriage, and so on. That's why the marriages don't happen. If the marriages do happen at an earlier age, like in Islam, it's like when you reach your puberty, you get married as soon as you can, like not so far away from the age of puberty. So if everybody does get married very soon after they reach their puberty, and then, for example, it won't be an economical problem because in the entire family, the brothers and sisters, like the sister would be going, she would be married at an early age, and then a wife would be coming in at the same age. So the person would not be supporting, but the father would be supporting the whole entire household. So it won't make much of a difference. So do you have any comments on that? And secondly, there is this research by Robin McKee in The Guardian about puberty age getting lower as we go on. It was, in German research, it was in 1860, the puberty age for a female was 16.5 years, I believe, and recently it's gone down to 10.5 years because of the media or other reasons. So do you have any comments on that? Thank you.
On the lowering age of puberty, there have been studies done on this in the Arab region, and my understanding is that one sees those trends as well in the Arab region. In terms of marrying right out of puberty, again, if we look back to ages past, if you're looking at a life expectancy of 30, for example, yes, of course, there were early marriages, not just in Islamic culture, but in cultures around the world. I think today that's really not relevant now, because it's not just economics which is now driving an increase in the age of marriage in many countries. If one looks at in the Gulf states, we have now more young women in education, in higher education, than we have men. And when women are educated, they want different things out of life. And we know that educating women does tend to raise the age of marriage. They want to finish their education. They want to have fewer children. Early marriage is frankly not good for girls. It's not good for their health. It's not good for the health of their children as well. But this question of marriage and women in marriage is absolutely key, because it's women who are the key to social change in the Arab region, and that they are educated and have autonomy within their relations with their parents, with their families, with their siblings, and with their husbands is absolutely key to social change. When people have asked me, what do you think is the single thing that needs to happen in order to make sexual life better, relations between men and women easier, better marriages, the single biggest change is going to be how mothers raise their sons. And that is much easier done if you have a woman who is educated and has a certain financial autonomy as well. You don't get that when you're 15. You have to wait until you're much older and in your 20s. So all the evidence points to the benefits of older age of marriage, not marrying early. But again, not all women have that opportunity. There is still enormous family pressure to marry. But no, I don't think just marrying girls at a younger age is going to solve the problems. Not at all. It's going to create problems.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Matteo. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Politics, Middle Eastern Studies. My question is, I would say, probably a little bit challenging. It probably is a little bit challenging in a way. You were talking about less sexuality corresponds in a way to more economic problems. This less openness. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Okay. This less openness to sexuality corresponds in a way to more economics and social problems in the region. But I was thinking about, to what extent does really talking openly about sex empowers people? Because we can see here in the West that there is a lot to talk about sex, but still we have a lot of problems about different areas. So how can talking about sex redress power issues? Because I think the sphere of sexuality in the Arab world is not just about mutilation and segregation, it's also about pleasure, I guess. So how do we deal with this issue?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question. But certainly, if one looks at what I would call disconnects for example. So if one looks in Egypt, we say to young people in Egypt, thank you, young people in Egypt, for having led us into uprising. And yet, we don't actually trust young people enough to give them information about their sexual life, about their reproductive lives. You need to walk the talk. If you want them to be fully engaged citizens, then also you need to give them the information that they can talk about those aspects of their lives which are closest to them, most personal to them. We don't do that. How can we expect women to be fully engaged and fully participatory in the workplace, for example, or in the parliament, if they actually don't have the ability to talk openly to the person who is closest to them about their fears and their desires and their needs? The personal and the political are connected, and of course the connection is not completely tight, and there are disjunctures and there are gaps. But I would argue that certainly bringing the freedom of expression and the freedom of thought into personal life, and not just sexual life, but more broadly, is actually tied to what is going to happen in political life as well. And it does change the dynamic between men and women, and it has to happen in the home and also in the public domain for it to really stick.
We're at 9:05. Are you happy to go on for a little longer?
Absolutely,
Okay.
as long as you
what
are.
What I thought we'd do now is we'll take a cluster of questions so that you've got a pen, so you can just write down. So why don't you go around and just take 4 or 5 questions so that get the audience have a chance to get out a lot of issues.
Number 1. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Thank you. Yep. It's Amir. I'm a third-year history student from Teesside University. It seems to be that more the emphasis, on women, that they are the weaker party here, with male being more on the winning side of it. So though we know that Arab world societies are more patriarchal societies, and of course with them being patriarchal societies, the male finding themselves, they have to be the dominant figure. So would you class that to be, they are themselves also becoming a victim of that?
So can you repeat the question, sorry?
The men themselves, they are growing into a society in the Arab world where they are, they're finding themselves, they have to be dominant. Mm-hmm. Or from the very young age, for example, a young boy, 10 years old, probably his father would tell him, you have to look out for your sister who's 20 years old, and watch where she's going. So are they also a victim of that with the woman, or is it only their fault at that?
That's a very good question, thank you.
Yes.
Hi there. You spoke about the disillusionment of the Egyptian people with the Grand Mufti, Sheikh Ali Goma. I wondered whether leading religious figures still have a role to play at the grassroots level in Egypt and across the Middle East.
Hi, I was just wondering whether you had an opinion on the popularity of artificial reproductive technologies in the Middle East, and the clear market that there is in countries, more liberal countries such as Lebanon, and notably there's an increase in the popularity and usage of artificial ARTs in more traditional countries such as Saudi Arabia, and whether this is exposing a change in the dynamic between the husband and wife, and whether you had a view of relating this to kind of the evolution of the dynamic in between the husband and the wife in the bedroom as well.
Hi, I'm just wondering that if during the course of your research, if at all you had any cause to chat with any people that were in polygamous relationships, and if so, to what extent sexual jealousy and sexual competition enters, for example, when a younger second wife comes on the scene.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm a Reformation historian, so I work on Europe and religion in the 16th and 17th centuries. And one of the very interesting things we see in early modern England is that the average age for marriage wasn't actually much lower than it is today. But obviously, premarital sex was completely taboo, and homosexuality was absolutely, it was illegal, it carried the death penalty latterly. What we see, however, is evidence of kind of lifestyle homosexuality, so premarital relations between people of the same sex who then went on to have kind of religiously, politically conventional marriages. And I'm wondering whether there's anything similar or analogous going on in conservative social and religious societies today.
Hi. I totally agree with that. In the Middle East, there is a need for education, especially in different aspects, religion and even sex and even political. However, the concern, taking a Western measurement, which is focusing on individualism and freedom of speech and everything, and taking the same measurement and putting in the Middle Eastern world, which is more focused on family and how you look at the family at one unit, apart from individualism, this is a big question. And actually what you said, is the Western world became how we see it now in the past 60, 70 years. Before that, most of women were not having sex before marriage and stuff like that. And taking measurement in the past just 60, 70 years and putting them on the Middle East to judge, this will be the question mark, and that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation and the discussion so far. It's Alice Panapinto from the law school. My question actually adds to one of the previous questions, and it's linked more specifically to female homosexuality, and whether in the course of your research you found perhaps some similar considerations that could be made in Victorian England and gay women then as being relevant to being a gay woman in the Arab world today. So the double-edged sword of perhaps a lifestyle choice which can carry on under the radar of the patriarchy, but also by the same token, the non-acknowledgement of that lifestyle choice, which feeds back into the Victorian era approach. Thank you.
Take your time.
Yeah, at least 2 hours, I think. David had warned me that there was a highly educated, highly inquisitive audience, and here is proof positive. So I'll try to take these questions in order, and my apologies if I don't recall all of your names. It's Samir? Amir, hi. Amir, so it's very interesting. Again, we have these our patriarchal societal social structures in the Arab region, and yet we know so little about men, quite frankly. When it comes to aspects of sexuality, because the easiest way to talk about sex is in the context of a problem. So disease, dysfunction, exploitation. And if you frame sex that way, men are seen as the perpetrators of this. And so we tend to focus on the victims, women. So actually we know very, very little about how men feel about sexual life, about how men feel about life in general, how they feel about women's empowerment. There's a real gap. We don't have masculinity studies, men's studies in the Arab region as you find it in other parts, certainly in the West and elsewhere in the global South. And certainly anecdotally, the men I've spoken to feel very frustrated. They themselves feel that they have actually fewer choices in life. If I look at my own family in Egypt, and we are an educated upper middle class family, if I look at the women in my family, the women can choose to cover or not, they can go on to university or not. Most want to get married, but some do not. They can have children or not, they can work or not, they have choices. If I look at the men in my family, what is their choice? You have to go to university. You have to get a job because you have to go on and get married and establish your own family. And very often men feel that they are constrained. And certainly evidence from around the world shows that when you put men under pressure, men tend to behave badly. And the people they tend to behave badly are the next down the line in the patriarchy, and those tend to be women. And again, in a patriarchy, it's not all that great if you're not at the top of the tree. And most men find themselves further down, particularly in Egypt, if you can't get a job, if you don't feel you can move on in your life. Tremendous frustrations. We know very little about what men want. And it's one of the aspects of research that certainly I encourage in my book. But we don't know enough yet, and hopefully that research will be able to take off in the years to come. So thank you very much for raising that very important point. On the point of the role of religious figures, certainly they do have a very important role to play still in society, irrespective of the views of people, of the grandees of the religion, and certainly engaging them on these issues and informing them on these issues is very important, but it's a double-edged sword, because very often in some of the projects I've been involved in, for example, trying to educate religious leaders about homosexuality under the veil, if you like, of HIV, bringing them to the table. Very often they are as ignorant as anyone about homosexuality. You can get them to talk in a conference room, but it's very hard to get them to speak openly or change their discourse when they go out to give the sermon or the khutbah. And so working with them is important, but it's very difficult because they too have constraints and pressures and peer pressures, and they have a constituency to play to. And getting them to change their tune publicly can be very difficult, but there are some very interesting initiatives across the region looking at these issues, particularly in the context of HIV and violence against women. So they are important figures to engage. In terms of the popularity, the frequency of assisted reproduction, so IVF, again, in the Middle East, it's very important to have a child. And what's interesting in Egypt, for example, is that virtually no couple in their first year of marriage uses contraception. The survey data shows that very clearly, because you're expected to produce a child by the first wedding anniversary, and if you don't, it is a very big problem, not just for you, but the whole family gets involved in this. So the other side of this issue, the inability to have a child, infertility, is a very serious matter. And what's interesting is that in most places in the Arab region, still today, when a couple is infertile, suspicion almost always falls upon the wife. And it is generally the case that they will do all sorts of examinations. I know women who have started on infertility treatment after 6 months of marriage. And these are young women in their 20s. And I have to tell you, given the lack of sexuality education in the Arab region, you do have to wonder if couples are really consummating their marriages in a way that would lead to procreation. There's so little knowledge. And certainly assisted reproduction is becoming increasingly popular. There is reproductive tourism. Many couples, for example, will go to Lebanon. And one of the reasons for this is that assisted reproduction is quite limited in Sunni Islam. The only techniques which are permitted are in vitro fertilization. That's it, using the husbands and wives' gametes. Because anything else is considered to be zina, adultery, if you use sperm donation or egg donation, or even surrogacy is not permitted. But in Shia Islam, there's a very different school and line of jurisprudence. And so, again, donation of eggs certainly and surrogacy is permitted, and so that's why places like Lebanon in particular are becoming popular. Again, when you look at assisted reproduction, I talk about this in the book, in the context of the Arab region, all sorts of problems emerge. So, for example, when couples go to the clinic, men, of course, have to masturbate in order to give a sperm donation. to be used, but the problem is that masturbation is deeply troubling for many Muslims who, depending on the school of jurisprudence, some think it's completely haram. And so there are all sorts of additional problems. It's very difficult, for example, to do egg donation from Arab women, because in order to extract the eggs, you want to get them from young women, but many young women are not married. And of course, in order to extract the eggs, you would break the hymen, so that's not possible. It's not permitted, really. Most doctors don't want to do this. So there are all sorts of complications in this technology that are brought about by the social and cultural context. But yes, it does exist in the region. Yes, it is growing. And for those of you who are interested in how it affects the dynamics of relationships between husbands and wives, there's a great book written by an American anthropologist called Marcia Inhorn. It's called The New Arab Man, and it looks at how these technologies are changing dynamics within marriages. In terms of the question of polygamy, it's not something I looked at great detail because my book is mainly focused on Egypt, and polygamy is increasingly rare there for economic reasons, quite frankly. If you can barely afford to get one wife, how are you going to afford a second? It's not that polygamous unions don't exist, they do, but very often men will take not official wives, but what are called orfi wives. We have all these forms of unofficial marriage which are not registered by the state. They are more or less Islamically sound depending upon whom you ask. They give extramarital relations an Islamic cover. And so while that is common, official polygamous marriages, you don't see so much of them in Egypt now. In the wealthier Gulf states, of course, it's still an option because the standard of living is higher there for most people. I have to say that yes, I have spoken to women in polygamous unions in the Gulf, and what is interesting in particular is I have met young women who have actually chosen to become second wives. And one of them explained this to me quite interestingly. She's a career woman, and she said, "Why on earth would I want to be a first wife? The first wife, she has to feed the husband, she has to keep him clean, do the laundry, she has to maintain the husband. Why would I want to do that? As a second wife, I have all the pleasures of his company because in Islam, husbands are obligated, if they are going to take more than one wife, to treat each wife equally." She said, "It's fantastic. The first wife maintains him, and he comes to see me, and he sees me and so we enjoy our company." This woman wanted to have a child. Of course, having a child outside of marriage is basically a non-starter. And so this was her opportunity to fulfill her needs, her sexual needs and her needs as her desire to become a mother. So for her, as far as she was concerned, it was a win-win situation. Less so, though, often for the first wife, who often gets a very hard deal out of this. In terms of the woman in the front about the historical aspects of, I'm not quite sure of your point, which was about whether people were engaging in same-sex. Yes. Yeah. The history I will actually leave to an expert amongst us, Daniel Newman, who can talk at length, who has been translating a really wonderful book of Arabic erotica by a Tunisian author called Al Tifashi, which speaks at length about same-sex relations, and will also address the point from Ava. The point over here. Certainly, it is known that we think, and again, these are very vague estimates, that about 2 to 3% of the population in the Arab region is engaging in same-sex relations. That's on par with the global average. Yes, certainly it is known that, particularly in the Gulf states, that because of gender segregation, very often women are engaging in same-sex relations, and also men in same-sex relations, and then they go on to get married, and often continue these relationships as well. And how it compares to the historical perspective, I leave it to Professor Newman to address. On the question of female homosexuality, yes. It's very interesting, although the laws in most Arab countries come down very, very hard on male same-sex relations, and sodomy is criminalized. There are only a few countries which explicitly criminalize female same-sex relations. But essentially, across the Arab region, essentially there's almost a Clinton-like definition of sex. If it doesn't involve a penis and penetration, it's not really sex. And so female homosexuality really isn't understood all that well. And I have many female friends, for example, who their female lovers come and go without comment, without question. And yet occasionally when they have a male colleague come to stay late at night, all hell breaks loose, basically. And it's actually a problem for women because if you're a woman who loves other women, it's often very isolating. And that's because men, although male homosexuality is often in front of the firing line, men are men, and men can go out and they can meet other men in cafes, and they can strut, basically. But women are expected to keep silent about sex, irrespective of their inclination. And so the biggest problems I've found for women are just the loneliness and the isolation and the inability to meet other women. That being said, there are a number of NGOs which are springing up across the region. Interestingly, particularly amongst Palestinians living in Israel, which specifically address the needs of homosexual women, and they offer a very interesting model of how you get change, because it's quite subtle, and it's often they're interacting on the internet and online initiatives. So work is being done, but you're right, it is essentially off the radar screen. In terms of the gentleman who talked about the West, I mean, one of the points I make in my book quite clearly is that do not look at sexual change and sexual culture in the Arab region as it evolved in the West. The sexual revolution, if we like, in the West is the product of a very particular history. And it was laid by hundreds of years of political, economic, and social change, which preceded the decades of change. In the Arab region, it's a completely different history. It's a different culture, a different religious background. Change is coming in a different way. But you raise a very important point about the family. And this was really brought home to me when I talked to a gay activist in Lebanon, and we talked about the nature of sexual rights, individual rights, and a sexual identity. And she said to me, Shereen, what are you talking about, sexual identity? I don't even have an individual identity. On the books in the government in Lebanon, I am registered as the daughter of my father. And if I were to marry, I would become the wife of my husband. I'm not even seen as an individual, I'm seen as part of a collective. And so this is a really big difference in how we achieve individual rights, irrespective, and it's not just in sex, it's in politics, it's in economics, it's in other aspects of social life. Nonetheless, we have had this family dominance for millennia, and yet there have been times when we have been much more open about sexuality and much more willing to talk about these issues than we are today. So I don't think our cultural context constrains us in changing and achieving happier sexual lives, but that change will look quite different to the trajectory of change in the West and other parts of the world.
Before I thank you, the next Castle lecture will be very different from the subject of this evening. It's the Chancellor of the University, Sir Thomas Allen, who will be interviewed here around the theme of the future of classical music. So it'll be a unique opportunity, really, to engage with him. He is an opera singer, tenor of over 40 years, and has sung on the world stage, and it'll be a rather magical evening. So the date for that and the time is the same as today. The date, Patrick, do you remember? 20th of November, and the details again are on the college website and hopefully on the university website. So before I formally thank Shereen, here's the book. It actually exists. Buy it from your local bookshop or your Amazon bookshop.
Also, yeah. I have a website, sexinthecitadel.com, and it provides additional information, details for those of you who are studying anthropology or sociology, but also it's a chance to interact. So if you have questions or comments, please go on the website. Please make your contribution, and I would be glad to continue the discussion outside this hall.
And it remains then for me to thank you enormously for a great evening. I mean, an evening that obviously engaged the audience, so please join with me in recognizing what a great time we had. Thank you.